At my husband's funeral, my own sister stood up and claimed she was his wife. The room went silent. I heard gasps ripple through the pews like a wave crashing over jagged rocks, and all I could do was sit there, frozen in that moment, clutching the edge of the bench as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth. People turned their heads, eyes wide, some whispering, some staring at me to see how I would react, but I didn't flinch. Not a tear fell, not a single gasp escaped my lips. Because as shocking as her words sounded to everyone else, they weren't news to me. I already knew her game. I had seen it coming long before this day. And while she thought my grief would paralyze me, that I'd crumble under the weight of her betrayal, she had no idea that I'd been quietly preparing for this very moment. She thought she was the mastermind, the one in control, but really, I was already 3 steps ahead. Now, let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story didn't begin with a bold claim at a funeral. It started long before, with a family I thought I could trust, and a sister I thought would always have my back. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for nearly 20 years. We built a life together full of laughter, struggles, and the kind of quiet love that comes from knowing someone through every season of life. He wasn't perfect, but he was mine, and in all the years we shared, I never doubted his loyalty. I wish I could say the same about my sister, Clara. Clara was complicated. She was the type of person who wore charm like a mask, who knew how to smile sweetly and make you feel special while secretly calculating what she could take from you. Growing up, I brushed off her selfishness as sibling rivalry. She was the younger one, always comparing herself to me, always trying to outshine me in front of our parents. I'd win a prize at school, she'd sulk until she got something of her own. I'd buy a new dress, she'd somehow manage to find the exact same one and flaunt it as if she wore it better. Petty things, right? But over the years, those little moments grew into something darker, sharper. When I met Daniel, she acted supportive. She smiled, congratulated me, even helped me pick out flowers for the wedding. But behind closed doors, I caught the way she looked at him. The lingering glances, the way she laughed just a little too hard at his jokes. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. She was my sister, after all. But it didn't take long for me to realize that Clara didn't see Daniel as untouchable. She saw him as something I had that she wanted, and that was Clara's pattern in life. She always wanted what wasn't hers. For years, she circled us like a vulture. At family gatherings, she'd make comments about how handsome he was. She'd ask him personal questions, things that made me uncomfortable, as though testing the boundaries. Daniel never entertained it. He was polite, but distant. He knew where his loyalty lay, and that loyalty was with me. Still, Claire's envy simmered just beneath the surface. I should have cut ties back then, but you know how it is with family. You convince yourself that blood matters, that they'll grow out of it, that you can manage the damage. Then Daniel got sick. It wasn't sudden, but it wasn't expected either. A long, grueling illness that drained him little by little, day by day. I stayed by his side through it all. Doctor's appointments, sleepless nights, moments of fear when I didn't know if he'd make it to the morning. And wouldn't you know it, that's when Clara reappeared in our lives with full force. She started visiting more often, bringing food, offering to help. To outsiders, she looked like a doting sister stepping up in a time of crisis. But I saw through it. I saw the way she would sit too close, her hand brushing his arm as she handed him a glass of water, the way she'd linger in the room when I left to fetch medicine. I confronted her once, told her she was crossing boundaries. She laughed in my face and said, "Oh, come on, don't be so paranoid. He's your husband, not mine." But the gleam in her eye told me she enjoyed watching me squirm. Daniel passed quietly one rainy night, holding my hand, whispering that he loved me. I thought the hardest part was over, that now it was just grief and healing. But I should have known Clara wasn't finished. That was never her way. Her obsession wasn't about love, not really. It was about possession. And the moment Daniel was gone, her sights shifted entirely, not just to his memory, but to everything he left behind. The house, the inheritance, the life we built together. And that's how we got to this day. So there we were, at his funeral, the air heavy with sorrow, the scent of lilies clinging to the room, when Clara stood up in front of everyone. She cleared her throat dramatically as though she were preparing for a performance, and with a voice that dripped with fake pain, she said, "I need to speak the truth. Daniel wasn't just her husband. He was mine too." The collective gasp that followed was almost deafening. People turned, eyes darting between us like they were watching a scandalous play unfold. My mother buried her face in her hands, my father shook his head in disbelief, and even the pastor froze mid-step. But me? I just sat there, calm, steady, because I knew this was coming. Clara thought she could blindside me, that my grief would crumble, but she underestimated me. She thought she was dropping a bombshell, but what she didn't know was that I had already lit the fuse long before today. And that's where the story truly begins, because in that moment, I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was a woman ready for war. Clara thought she'd play her little game and win, but I had been quietly setting the stage for her downfall. And trust me, I wasn't going to let her walk away with my husband's name, my home, or the life we built together. No. If she wanted to turn my grief into a battlefield, then she was about to learn just how ruthless I could be. Tell me, what would you have done if your own sister stood up at your husband's funeral and tried to steal everything from you? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have fought back the way I did? Because I promise you, the road from that moment to revenge was not quick, not easy, and definitely not pretty. But every single step was worth it. I did not answer her that day. I let her speak. Let her play the part of the grieving stranger who suddenly remembered a lifetime with my husband. I watched the way she lip-shaped the words, watched the practiced tremor in her voice, the little pause she took when looking at our family as if searching for approval. She was auditioning for sympathy and inheritance in the same breath.
After she finished, some of the cousins murmured. A few older acquaintances leaned forward, curious, hungry for scandal. People like a story they can pass on. They don't want facts. They want a good show. Clara gave them what they wanted. When the funeral ended and people drifted into polite conversations and casseroles, I let the neighbors bring flowers and the pastor offer hollow condolences. Behind the closed door of our kitchen, I finally let myself breathe. I cried then, not the theatrical kind, but a raw, honest loss that shook me from the inside. I let the grief roll through me, and after it passed, something else settled in its place. A cold clarity. Clara's words had been a provocation. She'd forced my hand, whether she meant to or not. The first thing I did was practical. I got up the next morning and called the lawyer. Daniel and I had been careful. Some people are, some are not. And thankfully, we had estate papers in order, a will that named me as the sole beneficiary. But wills are words on paper, and grief clouds judgment. Wresting control from a grieving widow is a common con. Clara knew to cause a scene. She knew the social pressure would make people question whether the will reflected the truth of Daniel's relationships. So I duplicated the paperwork, tucked it into my bag, and then ordered certified copies to be sent to the attorney, the bank, and the executor we'd appointed years ago. I made sure the will was airtight, and I made sure there was proof. That was the legal side. The other side, Clara's court of public opinion, required a different strategy. She thrived on gossip. She fed off whispers. To defeat her, I would have to starve her audience. I began to document everything. I started a folder on my phone and labeled it with dates. Photos of Clara's visits, text messages where she'd flirted casually with Daniel, emails where she'd offered help, followed by veiled comments about entitlement. I copied bank transfers, small loans she'd promised to repay and never did. The time she borrowed money for a car repair and conveniently forgot to mention her new phone. Little things that, when strung together, showed a pattern. People underestimate how persuasive a trail of small betrayals can be when presented calmly. If you shout, they call you bitter. If you whisper with evidence, they lean in. So I whispered. I didn't email anyone angrily. I sat down with family members one by one. First, my parents, because they still mattered to me, and went through everything. I showed them receipts, messages, and the will. I watched faces change in real time. Shock at the audacity, recognition of patterns they'd winked at, then the grim settling of a new allegiance. Some were hurt that they'd been fooled. Some were embarrassed they believed Clara's performance. But most of all, they were human. And humans preferred to believe the version of a story that preserves their place in it. I gave them a version that kept them comfortable, with me as the steady center and Clara as the outlier. Clara didn't stop. If anything, she pushed harder, fueled by the whispers she'd ignited at the funeral. She showed up at the house more often under the pretense of helping with paperwork, pulling on gloves and pretending to sort mail. She tried to charm the neighbors, draping herself over the porch rail like she belonged there. She badgered the executor, called the bank, tried to press claims about long conversations she'd had with Daniel about shared plans. She leaned on people who owed her favors, old school friends and a cousin who still believed in loyalty as an old currency. I expected resistance. I prepared for lies. What I didn't expect was how many tiny allies would reveal themselves once asked. The hospice nurse who had cared for Daniel took my call and agreed to write a statement about Clara's behavior at the bedside, how she would linger after visiting hours and insist she had been close to him. The delivery driver who brought groceries to our house remembered Clara's frequent, convenient arrivals and the packages she took. The barista at the cafe where Clara worked part-time gave me informal notes about Clara's sudden spending, small but telling. Bills for jewelry, nights out that didn't line up with her supposed money troubles. These people didn't want to be involved, but when I approached them without accusation and with respect for their chime, they were willing to help. Call it curiosity, call it morality, call it boredom. Whatever it was enough. Parallel to that, I staged a quieter war. I started seeding doubt in places Clara cared about most, among her circle and on social platforms where she thrived. Not lies, just truth told in a way that highlighted contradictions. I posted photos from old family holidays where Clara stood visibly separate from Daniel in pictures she'd later used to show closeness. I commented, lightly, under one of her popular posts, "It's strange to see how quickly some people become close when there's something to gain." People saw it and reacted. I watched as allies slipped away from her feed, likes dropped, and comments that once boosted her confidence turned into a smattering of support from people who were starting to see her as performative. Clara noticed. Her smile at family dinners became sharper, her barbs thinner, her attempts at charm more frenetic. She started to accuse me in front of others, once in a tone loud enough to cut the air. "You're weaponizing grief." She told anyone who would listen that I was paranoid, that I'd been dressing her up as the villain for attention. I let her. Every accusation was a confession. In public, she was loud. In private, she was unraveling. She sent me texts, some pleading, some threatening. One read, "You can't take this from me. He loved me too." I saved them all. You'd be surprised how a screenshot of a desperate text looks like evidence when laid beside a will.
There were setbacks. A cousin who had been neutral turned suspicious after Clara whispered a version of the story to them that painted me as a greedy widow protecting assets. A minor court hiccup forced me to hire an additional paralegal to expedite paperwork. I had to spend money I'd prefer to set aside for simpler things like groceries. Every move I made had a price. Revenge is not glamorous. It's an accounting of costs and decisions. But every time Clara scored a small victory, an ally here, a rumor there, I countered it with proof, patience, and the slow erosion of her narrative. I also recruited a different kind of ally, my own resolve. Grief can be a quicksand that swallows you if you let it. I refused that. I made a schedule, morning walks to clear the fog, evenings to comb through messages and receipts, and nights where I let sorrow have its way. I worked, not because I wanted vengeance, but because I wanted to preserve what Daniel and I had built. That preservation became a mission. Protect the house, protect the accounts, protect Daniel's memory from being co-opted by someone who never loved him in any real sense. There was a moment, about a month after the funeral, where I thought I'd lost. Clara had gone to the local paper with a tear-stained interview claiming Daniel had promised her a future and the will did not reflect what was in his heart. The reporter asked to see any proof. Clara offered none, only theatrics and anecdote. But theatrics sell papers. The article painted a messy picture to a town already thirsty for drama. I could have sued for libel. I could have called the paper and demanded retraction. Instead, I took a breath and did something else. I offered to talk to the reporter myself, calmly, honestly. I sat with the journalist and told the story without fury. I handed over the papers. I offered witnesses. I did not attack Clara personally. I presented facts. The result was a second piece, a quiet, factual correction that tilted public sympathy back toward me. Not a resounding victory, but a necessary shift. As the weeks rolled on, the tension reached new heights. Clara's desperation became visible. Lists of calls, visits to the bank, whispered meetings with a local attorney. But desperation leads to mistakes. She began to overreach. She flirted clumsily with a neighbor who'd been a close friend of ours, leaving voicemails that sounded more possessive than genuine. She tried to arrange for an appraisal of the house, hinting she was considering legal routes. Each misstep she made fed the dossier I was building. If you're still with me, think for a moment. Would you have done the same? Would you have documented every petty theft, every manipulative compliment? Be honest, would you have kept receipts while you were still grieving? Because that's the brutal calculus of surviving betrayal. It's not pretty, but it's effective. And by the time I was ready to go on the offensive, I had a map, a paper trail, witnesses, and a town that had started to whisper less and observe more. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. But revenge, as I learned, is never just about exposing the other person. It's about forcing a reckoning that changes the balance of power permanently. And to do that, I needed a plan that would not only reveal Clara's intentions, but would also protect me from legal and social counters. I knew what to do next. I just needed to make sure I could pull it off without turning into the thing I hated. The plan required patience, deception, and a theatrical reveal. It required me to look like the grieving widow while I quietly closed the trap. There would be more close calls, more nights I questioned whether any of this was worth the toll. There would be moments when a single misstep could blow everything up. But if you want to hear how the plot tightened and how I lured her into a downfall she couldn't imagine, keep listening. Because the next part is where I begin to lay the final tracks of her undoing. I started the first move of the trap like a chess player, opening with a pawn. Small, unthreatening, but exact. I hired a trusted appraiser to evaluate the house, but I didn't tell him why. I asked him to be discreet and to provide a detailed written report that included dates, photos, and a careful chain of custody for every document he touched. Then I made a show of being frail and tired because acting wounded is the easiest mask to wear after real loss, and I let Clara think she'd won the sympathy game. She smiled at me in the kitchen, sharp and satisfied, as though she had already slipped her hand into the will. Meanwhile, I quietly transferred a few documents to a safety deposit box and had a friend pick them up. I changed passwords, set up two-factor authentication, and made sure that any legal moves required more verification than a sob story could buy. The centerpiece of my plan, though, was more delicate. I needed to turn her own weapon, her charisma and connections, back on her. So I arranged small, seemingly accidental meetings that were anything but. I set up a lunch where Clara would inevitably run into the executor. I scheduled a casual tea with the neighbor who'd shown interest in her. I called a few folks who had attended the funeral and hinted very carefully that there were inconsistencies in Clara's timeline. Each encounter was designed to put pressure on her, to make her slip in front of witnesses who would later be willing to speak up. It was petty, maybe a little cruel, but it worked. One evening, she snapped. It was a mistake I'd been waiting for. She cornered me on the porch under the sodium glow of the streetlight, voice low, eyes wild. "You can't keep doing this," she hissed. "You think you're so clever?" I smiled, which only seemed to enrage her more. "You think you're protecting his memory? You're smothering it." Her hands trembled as she reached for my arm. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let her look at my face, at the fatigue and the quiet fury, and I said, "I am protecting him from people who want to turn him into a prop." Her expression changed, and in that moment, she knew I was no longer the easy target she'd expected. But like any good plot, things didn't go according to plan without a few detours. There were 2 nights that nearly ruined everything. The first came when a distant cousin, whom Clara had been cultivating for weeks, came to me with panicked eyes. "She told me the will was invalid," he said. "Someone at the bank is looking into alternate versions. I don't know what to believe." Panic felt like an animal watching me from the shadows, sharp and quick. I called the bank myself, spoke to the manager, and learned that someone with a familiar name, had filed a request for a copy of the will to be reviewed. They hadn't yet produced anything, but the clock was ticking. I felt my chest tighten. If a forged document showed up, it would be a mess. I spent that night awake, running through contingencies. I called my lawyer, who reassured me but insisted we move faster. We locked down records, subpoenaed emails, and this part felt dirty. Even hired a private investigator to see if Clara had ever been to a notary, met with an attorney under a false name, anything that could point to forgery. It was expensive and exhausting, but the stakes were our home and my husband's name. At 3 a.m, I found myself weeping on the kitchen floor, not from sorrow this time, but from the fatigue of fighting while still grieving. Have you ever been so tired that your bones felt like paper? That was me. The second near ruin was almost more humiliating. Clara, sensing pressure, decided to go loud. She posted a video, grainy, overdramatic, on social media, where she cried on camera, telling the town she'd been Daniel's second wife in secret. The comments exploded. People I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me with condolences that turned into questions. Wouldn't I want the truth out? Wouldn't I want a man's wishes clarified for peace? The video went semi-viral for our town, and for a day, I felt the entire world tilt to her narrative. My hands shook. I could have retaliated by attacking her publicly, but I instead chose a different weapon: calm. I recorded a short statement, measured, composed, and I posted it with scanned, time-stamped copies of the will and a note that more evidence would be made available to anyone who asked. It didn't make headlines, but it made a quiet, solid counterweight. People who cared about facts more than theater read it. The momentum shifted back bit by bit. While all this was happening, I kept a private life, paying bills, answering mail, sitting in Daniel's chair at night and telling him about the little absurd things, how the kettle had started whistling louder, how the cat refused to sleep in the bed we shared. Grief never leaves you neatly. It breaks into your life and rearranges the furniture. But in the rearrangement, I found an odd clarity. I could feel the old me, the one who loved Daniel and laughed at his terrible jokes, still there, but tempered by a new edge. Every document I collected, every witness who promised a statement, every bank confirmation was another stitch in a net that would not be easily torn. And then came what I'd been waiting for, a small victory that revealed a larger truth. A neighbor, one of those quiet, unassuming people who notice everything, came forward with a story. She had been watching Clara for months and had kept a small notebook of dates when Clara had visited. She handed me pages of details, afternoons she'd left with bags, odd phone calls at strange hours, the dates Clara said she'd been with Daniel that didn't match hospital logs. It was obsessive, perhaps, but it was exactly the pattern I needed. I took the notebook to my lawyer, who smiled in a way that suggested we were finally close. Armed with this, we scheduled a mediation meeting under the guise of trying to avoid court. I wanted Clara to look like the instigator, not the victim. In front of the mediator, an older woman with a sharp gaze, I presented the documented timeline with calm precision. Clara, for her part, performed a different role. The wounded, the wronged, the innocent sister. She had practiced her lines so well that a stranger might have believed them. But in the room, eyes flicked to the dates. The mediator asked questions. I kept my voice steady and let the evidence do the rest. When the mediator suggested we have the hospital and hospice testimony reviewed formally, Clara's confident mask cracked. Her smile faltered. You could see the panic bloom in her pupils like a storm cloud.
That panic led to her next mistake. She called a lawyer I'd flagged previously, an old college friend of hers, and asked for representation. He was reluctant to take a case without clear evidence, so she, in her desperation, offered him an out, a confession that she hoped would sway people to her side. She wrote a letter, a fabricated recollection of private conversations with Daniel that painted their relationship as clandestine and deep. In her haste, she used phrases Clara often used in everyday speech, phrases that were public and unmistakably hers. The letter was sloppy. It was emotional, overwrought, and, crucially, it contradicted timestamps on social media and bank transactions we'd already secured. My lawyer found the contradictions quickly. I felt a cold thrill, not of malice, but of justice. The letter that was meant to be her salvation became a noose. It was submitted to the mediator's file and later to the court record. When Clara realized what had happened, she did something I didn't expect. She lashed out. She started calling people, friends, old neighbors, even strangers, trying to salvage the narrative by creating new versions of the past. When that failed, she accused me personally of erasing her history with Daniel. I saved those voicemails too. By now, people were starting to look at Clara differently. The town's gossip engine, once her ally, was sputtering. She'd gambled on spectacle and lost to patience. But the last move, the one that would finish her off, required more than paperwork. It required theater. It required the public to see the small, repeated actions that revealed a nature, not just a story. So I planned a reveal. Not in a courtroom, not in a paper, but where the story lived, the community center, during a volunteer night where Clara had volunteered to help organize a memorial for Daniel. She'd proudly put her name on the flyer, making herself look magnanimous. That hubris was delicious. I called a few trusted friends and asked them to come that night. I arranged for the hospice nurse to be there. I ensured the mediator would drop by. It looked like a coincidence, but everyone there would see the same thing at the same time. I wanted people to witness her in action, how she moved, what she said when she thought no one important was watching. The night arrived. Clara stood at the head of the room, cueing volunteers and smiling in that practiced way of hers. I sat in the back with my hands folded and my heart thudding a steady drum. Around me were the people who had helped, one by one, to stitch together her unraveling: the neighbor with the notebook, the hospice nurse with her testimony, the barista who'd noticed Clara's sudden spending, the mediator who'd read the contradictory letter. I watched Clara in the glow of the fluorescent lights, thinking of how we used to share secrets late into the night, how different everything had become. When the conversation turned to the memorial and people asked for her ideas, she spoke with confidence. Then someone asked about legal matters, the will, and the hospice nurse, quietly, mentioned how Clara had behaved at the bedside and how odd it had been that she claimed intimacy where none existed. A murmur rippled through the room. I felt my fingers go cold. Clara's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, looked around, and found only faces that no longer believed her. For a moment, she looked like a child caught doing something small and shameful. That scene, her smallness in a room of witnesses, felt like a verdict. I don't revel in other people's fall. Revenge, in my telling, is not about gloating. It's about restoration of balance. But I will tell you this. Watching her try to string together explanations in front of people who had already seen through her was oddly cleansing. She stammered, apologized, and then left early, her exit small and graceless. Later that night, I received a call from the bank. They were closing the inquiry. The mediator recommended no further action against me. The town's gossip moved on to other things. The house remained mine. There were consequences: a bruised heart, a relationship or two that never healed, and the hard knowledge that a sister I once loved had chosen greed over family. But I had protected what mattered. I had kept Daniel's memory from being rewritten by someone who never truly knew him. And while the path there was messy and human and at times ugly, it led to a place of a certain justice. If you've ever had to fight for something that felt as sacred as a memory, you know it's never clean. Tell me, would you have staged the same scenes? Would you have gathered witnesses and led the orchestra of quiet attention? Be honest, because sitting in that community center, watching the fallout, I realized revenge wasn't the end. It was a means to an end. The chance to take back a narrative that had been stolen and to stand, finally, with the truth. The night after the community center, the air around the house felt different, thinner, like a curtain someone had ripped away. People who had been unsure suddenly had edges. The bank called with formal language I'd been desperate to hear. No further action. The mediator sent a polite note. The hospice nurse thanked me in a message that felt almost like absolution. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, there was just a hollow, exhausted sort of relief. Clara's worst scheming had stalled, but the way she'd flailed when the lights were on had made one thing painfully clear. Desperation makes people dangerous. And dangerous people make mistakes. Within days of her public unraveling, Clara did something reckless. She tried to forge a small but crucial document, a note that supposedly memorialized a conversation she claimed to have had with Daniel about shared plans and the house transfer. It was the kind of thing an unscrupulous person thinks can tip the scale. A handwritten, signed page presented as memory made concrete. Maybe she thought the raw emotion of grief would swallow any scrutiny, or maybe she thought the chaos of losing someone would let her slip under the waves unnoticed. She was wrong. I can still see the private investigator's face when he called me into his office with that slow, almost apologetic smile people use when they don't want to be the bearer of bad news. He tried to get it notarized under an alias, he said. We found ticket stubs to the notary's office. We compared handwriting. It's not clean. He spread pages across his desk. Her letter, side by side with texts and notes, and then a forensic printout that showed, meticulously and damningly, how the strokes didn't match the cadence of someone writing from memory. They matched the cadence of someone coupling. The PI had even recorded a conversation where Clara admitted, in a voice threaded with panic and whiskey, that she hadn't actually been alone with Daniel the months she had claimed. She'd been at a B&B 2 towns over. She'd been with friends. The irony was slow and almost cruel. She'd tried to create intimacy out of absence, and in doing so, she'd left a map of the places she hadn't been.
That night, when the police knocked, I didn't go to the door at first. I wanted the sound of the knock to wash over me unnoticed, to be something that belonged to someone else's life. But it was my life. It was my name on the file. I opened the door and saw 2 officers and the detective who'd handled the inquiry. He looked tired and professional. "We have enough to present to the district attorney," he said. "We'll recommend charges for attempted fraud and forgery." The words landed like a physical blow and then felt like a release. Justice finally had a name. Process. It was ugly, but it was clean in its own way. There are moments in legal proceedings that feel theatrical and moments that feel painfully mundane. The arraignment was both. Clara sat small in the courtroom, makeup heavy in the way people use color to armor themselves. And for the first time, I saw the rawness beneath the performance. The defense lawyer, a seasoned operator who moved like a shadow, tried to spin the story. Misunderstanding, grief, poor judgment. The prosecutor, quieter, laid out the documents and the certified chain of custody, the notary's records, the handwriting analysis. You could see the narrative tighten. This wasn't 2 lovers misremembering. It was someone trying to write a life she hadn't lived and then selling the pages. When the judge set bail, Clara looked at me like she wanted something other than justice, a look that asked for pity and forgiveness in the same breath. I thought of our childhood, of shared bedrooms and scraped knees, of whispering under the covers about the future. I thought of every time she'd chosen herself over us. I felt a current of grief for the sister I thought I had, and then I let it pass. There are people you mourn for because they die. There are people you mourn for because they betray you. Both hurt, but only one requires a legal response. The case moved forward, and with it the theater of cross-examination and testimony. The private investigator came and told a careful clinical story about dates and places and purchases. The hospice nurse testified about shifts and visits and the way Clara would linger after visiting hours, the way she'd ask questions that weren't comforting, but searching. The neighbor with the notebook read her entries aloud, voice soft but steady. It felt like each small detail was a chisel strike, revealing the statue of the truth inside the stone of rumor. People in the gallery, once gossips, then allies, then former friends, attended in the tweed silence that courts have a way of imposing. I sat in the second row and felt the weight of each pair of eyes like a ledger balancing. Clara's defense tried to make much of my motives, painting me as vindictive, someone who would invent a narrative to keep what was mine. They asked about my financial decisions, about the timing of the will being finalized, about whether I had the means to hire investigators. They tried to make me look like an accuser instead of an injured party. A woman in a wool coat in the gallery, a distant cousin, neutral until now, shuffled forward and testified about watching Clara cultivate relationships to get close to Daniel. Another witness described Clara's sudden spending sprees, the night she went out with new friends and came back wearing jewelry she hadn't had before. Each testimony carved a new slice from the lie Clara had made for herself. The most dramatic moment, though, came not from a witness, but from a recording the PI had captured. It was a phone call between Clara and someone she was trying to persuade into corroborating her story. And in it, she used language that reeked of calculation. You have to say you were there. Say he told you. It wasn't a confession of love. It was an attempt to manufacture a memory. The room held its breath. The defense's hands trembled slightly. You could feel the scale tip as if the air itself had decided which side it would support. Clara broke during the trial in a way that didn't make it easier for either of us. On the third day, after hours of testimony, she sat in the witness chair and answered with the practiced poise she'd used for years. But then a question about why she had written certain phrases in the forged note made her eyes glaze and her voice crack. She admitted, haltingly, that she had been lonely, that life had been difficult, that she had watched Daniel and me and imagined something different. She said she'd loved him in a way that might not make sense to other people. The courtroom stilled. Her confession was not a confession of romantic fidelity. It was a confession of smallness and poor choices, the kind of human mess that doesn't excuse a crime, but shows why it happened. People like drama, and they like clarity. The jury found what I already knew in my bones, a pattern of manufactured intimacy and attempted document forgery that rose from greed more than grief. The verdict was not theatrical, it was procedural and precise, but when it came, it loosened a tension I hadn't known how tightly I'd been holding. Clara was convicted on the charges that fit the evidence. Her sentence was modest, a combination of fines and community service and a short stint, but the social consequences were harsher. She lost trust that money can't buy back. She found herself alone in a way she had never been. For me, the legal victory was a two-sided thing. It protected the estate, and it exposed the truth, but it also meant my family was fractured beyond casual repair. After the verdict, Clara wandered the few relationships she hadn't yet burned, trying to piece together a life that hadn't been built on performance. Once, she left a note under my door, a messy apology that asked for time and forgiveness in the same breath. I kept that note in a drawer for weeks and read it like a relic, more about who she no longer wanted to be than who I wanted her to be. At night, I would imagine conversations where we sat across from each other and shared memories without knives. Those imaginings felt like prayers that didn't always get answered. Confrontation eventually happened, not in a courtroom, not in a public square, but in a quiet winter gray morning when she came to the porch and asked, bluntly, for a seat and a cigarette. I surprised myself by letting her sit. We didn't speak for a long time. The cat wound around her ankles, filling the space with a domestic normalcy that neither of us deserved nor could claim. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "I didn't mean for it to get like this." Her voice was the voice of someone who had been found out and then found smaller than she thought she was. I thought if I made it true, I could make it mine. I told her something I hadn't planned. You made choices when I was grieving, when I trusted you would be family. You took advantage. My words were not delivered with triumph. They were delivered with the fatigue of someone who had been forced into battle. I wanted to be cruel, to let her feel the retracting scratch of a sister's betrayal, but I also remembered faces from the courtroom. The hospice nurse's tired compassion, the neighbor's notebook, the PI's steady professionalism. Justice, I had learned, was in facts, not cruelty. She cried then, quietly, not the loud, manipulative crocodile tears she'd used to sway a town, but a real small thing that sounded like a child who'd been scolded. It wrecked me. I'd imagined a different end to this story, 100 times, revenge served hot, humiliation public, some cinematic collapse. Instead, what I got was the slow, soft ache of a sister's admission and the knowledge that punishment and grief can live together in the same house and not make it better. We did not reconcile, not fully. There are things we don't get back. But there were moments of thaw, small, almost merciful exchanges that hinted at a future where words might be possible without knives. In the weeks that followed, I went about the business of cleaning out Daniel's drawers, reading his notes, listening to old voicemails where he joked about nothing and everything. I planted rosemary by the back fence because someone, an old aunt, or a book, said rosemary is for remembrance. The house felt lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because the immediate threat had been removed. Heavier because the silence Daniel left behind had weight and texture. I started seeing a therapist, not because I thought my revenge had been cathartic. It hadn't been entirely, but because I wanted to learn how not to let anger calcify into the shape of my life. There were practicalities, too. I had to repair relationships that Claire's actions had strained. A cousin who'd doubted me, neighbors who'd gossiped, friends who'd taken sides. I reached out, one by one, with honesty and small acts of repair. A letter, a casserole, an invitation to coffee. Some windows opened again, some remained shuttered. Life, I learned, is a ledger with many columns, not all of them monetary. And the house. I kept it. It wasn't just bricks and beams. It was where we had lived, loved, and lost. But I changed it. I painted the kitchen a softer color, bought new curtains that let the morning light in differently. Small things, perhaps. But these small things are how you tell the world that you are still living. I started volunteering at the hospice where Daniel had been cared for, not out of penance, but in gratitude for the way the staff had held space for us. Helping others with grief felt like an odd balm, a way to use the sharpness of my experience for something other than retaliation. People ask me, often, if I regret what I did. They ask if I would do it again, whether the months of legal wrangling and social theater were worth the cost. The answer is complicated. There were nights, still, when the memory of Clara's voice at the funeral would rise up like bile, and I would feel the old hunger for more than justice, for humiliation, for spectacle. But those nights gave way to mornings where I watered the rosemary and laughed at something small on television, and felt the sensation of a life that included both sorrow and surprise. If revenge is a dish, it didn't taste sweet forever. It tasted necessary, then tedious, then oddly empty. What mattered in the end was that truth had been restored, and that I had not let the scandal rewrite my husband's memory. So ask yourself, when family turns on you, when someone you loved tries to make themselves the center of your grief, what would you do? Would you fight in public? Would you gather evidence quietly and let it speak? Be honest, because the truth is not a universal thing. It's something you assert and defend in the ways you can. For me, defense meant paper trails and witnesses and a stubborn refusal to let Daniel's story be stolen. But your path might look different, and that's okay. There are days when I still see Clara in town, and the air between us is a thin place, taut, ready to snap. There are also days when I see her from afar, walking slower, shoulders slumping under the weight of consequences, and I feel a complex knot of pity and resentment. I do not pretend I've forgiven everything. Forgiveness is not a flip of a switch. But I do not let hatred be the second legacy of my husband's life. The story does not end with a neat moral. It ends with a life continuing. Grief softened into memory, revenge made space for repair, justice, slow and bureaucratic, did its job. In me, I learned to be quieter with my anger, to file away evidence but not live in it, to make room for the small joys that kept the house from feeling like a mausoleum. If you're listening and thinking about what you'd do, pick a side that preserves your dignity and the memory of those you loved. That's the lesson I learned, painfully and thoroughly. Would you have done the same? Would you have chosen patience over spectacle, evidence over screams? Be honest. Because sometimes the hardest revenge is the one that asks you to survive. The years that followed weren't quiet, not at first. Whispers still clung to me like burrs in the hem of a dress. Whenever I went to the grocery store or walked into church, I could feel eyes following me, some soft with sympathy, others sharp with curiosity. People love scandal. My life had been one for months. But as time went on, the whispers faded, replaced by the rhythms of ordinary days. School buses groaning down the street, neighbors mowing lawns, the smell of pies cooling in kitchens. The extraordinary drama of betrayal and trial gave way to the simple fact that I was still here. Breathing, standing, living. And that, in its own way, was a victory. Clara never disappeared entirely. She floated around the edges of town life, showing up for farmers markets or fundraisers, sometimes slipping in late to church and leaving before the final hymn. Her presence wasn't loud anymore. It was small, subdued, almost apologetic. I think she learned the hard way that attention isn't always love, that the kind of spotlight she craved could burn as easily as it could warm. Occasionally, our eyes would meet across a crowded room, and for a moment, it was like being children again, two sisters with scraped knees and big dreams. Then the memory of her standing at Daniel's funeral, declaring herself his wife, would come back like a knife in my ribs, and I'd turn away. Some wounds close, but leave the scar tissue tender forever. Still, life pushed forward. I poured myself into rebuilding what had been shattered. I traveled a little, something Daniel and I had always talked about but never managed. I took a trip to the coast, walked along cliffs where the sea crashed so hard it felt like the earth was roaring back at the sky. I sat with a book in small cafes, listened to strangers' conversations, and realized with a bittersweet clarity that the world was wide, and I was free to step into it. Grief still walked beside me, but it wasn't dragging me anymore. It was quieter, like an old friend who knew when to give me space. The house became my sanctuary again. For a long time, it had felt poisoned, like every room still echoed with the betrayal Clara tried to stamp into it. But as I filled it with small changes, fresh paint, new curtains, photographs of Daniel and me from younger, sunnier days, it softened. The rosemary by the fence grew tall, and I used it in cooking, in tea, sometimes just crushed in my palm for the scent. It reminded me of memory and resilience. I'd catch myself humming while watering plants or baking bread, and those moments startled me at first. The sound of joy creeping back in uninvited. Then I let them stay. They belonged. Every so often, I'd be asked about the ordeal. Someone new to town would hear pieces of the story and approach me with hushed curiosity. "Is it true that your sister claimed?" And I'd smile, small and tired, and say, "Yes, it's true, but it's over now." And that was the truth. It was over. Clara hadn't won. The inheritance, the house, the memory of Daniel, all of it remained where it belonged. Her lies had burned her reputation, not my life. I refused to let her betrayal be the headline of my story forever. There was one evening, though, years later, when Clara showed up at my door again. She was thinner, her face lined deeper than her age should have allowed, and her voice had lost that performative brightness she always wore like armor. She just said, "I'm sorry." No long speech, no excuses, no rehearsed drama. Just 2 words. I didn't invite her in. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. But I nodded. It was enough. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. A marker in time that said, yes, this happened, and yes, we lived through it. I think the hardest part of revenge is what comes after. People tell you it's sweet, that it fills the hollow places where betrayal once lived. And for a moment, maybe it does. But then the sweetness fades, and what's left is your own life, stretched out before you, asking, what now? For me, the what now was building something steadier, something honest. I found peace not in the drama of tearing someone down, but in the quiet persistence of standing back up. That's the truth nobody tells you about revenge. It's not the downfall of your enemy that defines you. It's what you do after, when the stage lights go out and you're left with your own reflection. So if you've listened this far, I'll ask you, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have let your sister stand at your husband's funeral and rewrite his story? Would you have stayed quiet in your grief, hoping the world would see through her lies? Or would you have done what I did, gathered your strength, your evidence, your resolve, and fought back until the truth stood taller than the betrayal? Be honest, because this isn't just my story. It's a story about anyone who has ever had to choose between silence and justice, between grief and rage, between revenge and survival. As for me, I chose survival. I chose truth. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all.